Are you ready for deep dive into Ontario's housing market? What I'm about to reveal might shock homeowners, potential buyers, and investors across the province. While everyone's been talking about recovery, the data tells a completely different story about what's coming in 2026. Let's talk about the elephant in the room that nobody wants to address. We're standing at the edge of what could be the most significant housing correction Ontario has seen in decades. While real estate agents are whispering about recovery, economists are sounding alarms about oversupply, weakening fundamentals, and a perfect storm brewing for 2026. Today, we're counting down the top 10 cities where home prices are most vulnerable to crash, starting from number 10. Number 10. Sudbury. Here's something that might surprise you about Sudbury. This mining town has become dangerously dependent on resource prices that are more volatile than a cryptocurrency market. The city's housing market has been artificially propped up by mining boom cycles, but here's the kicker. Global commodity demand is softening, and new mining projects are being delayed indefinitely. Sudbury's average home price jumped 35% during the pandemic, far outpacing local income growth. The problem? Most buyers stretched themselves thin with cheap money that's no longer available. With mortgage rates still elevated and mining employment showing signs of weakness, many homeowners are discovering they're trapped in properties they can't afford. The city's population has been slowly declining for years, yet housing prices kept climbing, a classic recipe for correction. What makes this particularly concerning is Sudbury's lack of economic diversification. When mining slows, everything slows. Local businesses struggle, unemployment rises, and suddenly those inflated home prices start looking unsustainable. The city is already seeing increased listings with longer days on market, a clear signal that seller desperation is beginning to set in. But Sudbury's challenges pale in comparison to what's happening in our next city. Number 9. Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay represents everything wrong with Ontario's smaller market dynamics rolled into one devastating package. This northwestern Ontario city has been hemorrhaging young talent for decades, leaving behind an aging population trying to maintain property values in a shrinking market. The numbers are absolutely brutal. Thunder Bay's population has declined by over 8% since 2000, while housing prices somehow managed to increase by 40% during the pandemic. It's like watching a car crash in slow motion, fewer buyers, more sellers, and prices that make no economic sense. The city's major employers, including the paper mills and grain terminals, have been cutting jobs consistently. Here's what really keeps local real estate agents up at night. Thunder Bay has one of the highest inventory-to-sales ratios in Ontario. Translation? Way too many homes for sale and not enough buyers. When you combine this with limited employment opportunities and harsh winters that make the city less attractive to newcomers, you've got a recipe for significant price drops. The city's remote location means it can't benefit from spillover demand from Toronto like southern Ontario markets. It's essentially an island, economically speaking, and islands tend to experience more dramatic price swings when market conditions change. This geographic isolation becomes even more problematic for our number 8 city. Number 8. Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie is facing what economists call a demographic cliff, and it's happening right now. The city's population has been in steady decline, dropping by nearly 15% over the past 2 decades. Yet somehow, housing prices increased by 45% during the pandemic, creating a massive disconnect between local economic reality and property values. The steel industry, which has been the backbone of this community for generations, is struggling with global competition and changing energy policies. Algoma Steel, the city's largest employer, has faced multiple restructuring efforts, creating job uncertainty that ripples through the entire housing market. When people aren't sure about their paychecks, they don't buy houses. It's that simple. But here's the most alarming part. Sault Ste. Marie has one of the oldest median populations in Ontario. As baby boomers look to downsize or move to warmer climates, who's going to buy their properties? The younger generation has largely moved to larger centers for better opportunities, leaving a shrinking pool of local buyers. The city's housing inventory has been climbing steadily, with some properties sitting on the market for 6 months or more. Local realtors are quietly advising sellers to reduce expectations, but many homeowners are still in denial about the new reality. When that denial breaks, price corrections tend to happen fast and dramatically. Speaking of denial, our next city has been living in a fantasy for years. Number 7, North Bay. North Bay presents a fascinating case study in how government employment can create a false sense of housing market security. The city has long relied on its status as a regional government center, but recent provincial budget constraints and digitization efforts are threatening this stability. The city's housing market exploded during the pandemic as people sought affordable alternatives to southern Ontario. Average home prices jumped by 38%, driven largely by external buyers who thought they were getting a bargain. The problem? Most of these buyers didn't understand the local economic fundamentals, or lack thereof. North Bay's private sector employment base is surprisingly thin. Remove government jobs, healthcare, and education, and there's not much left. The city has struggled for decades to attract significant private investment, leaving it vulnerable to policy changes that could reshape its employment landscape. With the provincial government looking to reduce spending and consolidate services, North Bay's job security isn't as ironclad as residents believe. The recent surge in listings tells the story clearly. Properties that would have sold in days 2 years ago are now sitting for months. Price reductions are becoming more common, and the desperation is starting to show. Local builders have also pulled back dramatically, recognizing that demand was artificially inflated. But government dependency is nothing compared to the industrial challenges facing our number 6 city. Number 6. Windsor's housing market is walking a tightrope over an economic abyss, and the rope is starting to fray. The city's fortunes have always been tied to the automotive industry, but that relationship has become increasingly toxic as manufacturing shifts toward electric vehicles and automation. Here's what industry insiders don't want you to know. The transition to electric vehicle production requires far fewer workers than traditional auto manufacturing. As plants retool for EV production, thousands of jobs are quietly disappearing. Ford's recent layoffs were just the beginning of a broader restructuring that will reshape Windsor's employment landscape. The city's housing market surged 42% during the pandemic, driven partly by Toronto's spillover demand and speculation about industrial revival. But speculation has a funny way of evaporating when reality sets in. Rising interest rates have already choked off most external buyer demand, leaving local buyers to support a market priced well above local income levels. Windsor also faces unique challenges from its border location. Economic uncertainty in both Canada and the U.S. creates double exposure to policy changes that could affect cross-border commerce. The city's commercial real estate sector is already showing stress, which typically precedes residential market corrections. Local real estate data shows increasing days on market and growing price gaps between seller expectations and buyer offers. The city's high inventory levels, combined with weakening employment fundamentals, suggest significant downward pressure on prices through 2026. This automotive dependency looks stable compared to the crisis brewing in our number 5 city. Number 5, Oshawa. Oshawa represents everything that can go wrong when a city builds its identity around a single industry, and that industry starts dying. General Motors closed its assembly plant in 2019, taking 1,500 direct jobs and thousands more indirect positions with it. The city is still reeling from this economic body blow. Despite this massive job loss, housing prices somehow managed to increase by 48% during the pandemic. This disconnection from economic reality was fueled by Toronto's spillover demand and cheap credit, both of which have largely evaporated. Now the city faces a harsh reckoning between inflated prices and diminished local buying power. The promised economic diversification has been mostly smoke and mirrors. While city officials talk about technology sectors and advanced manufacturing, The reality is that most replacement jobs pay far less than the GM wages that once supported the local housing market. Young people continue to leave for better opportunities elsewhere, eroding the buyer base. Oshawa's housing inventory has exploded over the past year, with sellers finally recognizing that the pandemic price surge wasn't sustainable. Properties are sitting longer, price reductions are becoming routine, and the desperation is palpable. Local builders have essentially stopped new construction, recognizing that supply already exceeds realistic demand. The city's infrastructure, built for a much larger population during its automotive heyday, now represents a massive maintenance burden that's becoming harder to support with a shrinking tax base. This creates additional downward pressure on property values as municipal services face potential cuts. But even Oshawa's challenges look manageable compared to what's happening in our number 4 city. Number 4, London. London's housing market is experiencing what happens when university town stability collides with economic reality. The city has long prided itself on being recession-resistant due to its education and healthcare sectors, but cracks are starting to show in this foundation. Western University, one of the city's economic anchors, is facing significant enrollment challenges as international student policies tighten and domestic demographics shift. Reduced enrollment means fewer students needing housing, which directly impacts both rental and ownership markets. The university has also been cutting programs and staff, reducing its economic contribution to the community. London's housing prices jumped 41% during the pandemic, largely driven by Toronto refugees seeking affordability. But as remote work policies tighten and Toronto companies call workers back to the office, many of these buyers are discovering they need to return to the GTA. This reverse migration is already showing up in listing data, with many properties clearly owned by people trying to relocate back to Toronto. The city's manufacturing sector, while smaller than automotive centers, is also facing headwinds from automation and global competition. Several major employers have announced downsizing or closure plans, creating job uncertainty that ripples through the housing market. Perhaps most concerning is London's massive condo development pipeline. Thousands of units are scheduled for completion through 2026, creating potential oversupply in a market that's already showing stress. Student housing demand, a key component of the rental market, is softening as enrollment declines and students face affordability pressures. This oversupply issue becomes even more dramatic in our number 3 city. Number 3, Hamilton. Hamilton's transformation from Steel City to Toronto bedroom community is unraveling before our eyes, and the housing market carnage could be spectacular. The city's recent price explosion was built on the premise that it could absorb Toronto's overflow demand indefinitely, a premise that's proving dangerously false. Housing prices in Hamilton increased by a staggering 52% during the pandemic, turning former industrial neighborhoods into million-dollar real estate markets overnight. This transformation was driven by Toronto buyers seeking affordability and the promise of GO-train connectivity. But rising interest rates have choked off much of this external demand, leaving local buyers to support prices that are completely disconnected from local incomes. The steel industry, still a major employer, faces existential challenges from environmental regulations and global competition. Stelco and ArcelorMittal have both announced significant restructuring plans that will eliminate hundreds of jobs. These are high-paying positions that directly supported the local housing market's recent boom. Hamilton's condo market is showing particularly troubling signs. Thousands of units are scheduled for completion through 2026, many purchased by investors during the pandemic frenzy. As these units come online, rental rates are already declining, making many investments unprofitable. Investor panic selling could accelerate price declines significantly. The city's infrastructure is also straining under rapid growth. Transit improvements have been slower than promised, making commutes to Toronto increasingly difficult as traffic congestion worsens. This reduces Hamilton's attractiveness to GTA workers, further eroding the buyer base that drove recent price increases. But Hamilton's industrial base still provides some stability compared to the service sector vulnerability of our number 2 city. Number 2, Kitchener-Waterloo. The Kitchener-Waterloo region represents the biggest housing bubble outside the GTA, and it's showing all the classic signs of an impending spectacular crash. The area's tech sector boom created a false sense of economic invincibility that drove housing prices to absolutely insane levels. Home prices in the region increased by 46% during the pandemic, reaching levels that made Silicon Valley engineers do double takes. This was supposed to be justified by the area's thriving tech ecosystem, centered around companies like BlackBerry, Google, and numerous startups. But the tech winter has arrived with a vengeance, and the region's startup ecosystem is withering. Venture capital funding has dried up, forcing dozens of local startups to close or dramatically downsize. BlackBerry continues to shed employees, and even major tech companies are implementing hiring freezes and layoffs. The University of Waterloo, long a source of talent and economic stability, is facing budget pressures that could reduce its regional economic contribution. Here's the really scary part. Much of the region's recent housing demand came from highly leveraged tech workers who assumed their stock options and bonuses would continue growing indefinitely. As these compensation packages evaporate, many recent buyers are discovering they can't actually afford their mortgages without the extra income they'd counted on. The region's rental market is also showing stress as tech companies reduce office space and implement permanent remote work policies. Many condo investors who banked on steady rental income from tech workers are finding themselves with vacant units and mortgage payments they can't cover. Construction activity has plummeted as builders recognize that demand was artificially inflated. The region faces potential oversupply as projects started during the boom come online into a much weaker market. All of these challenges pale in comparison to the catastrophe brewing in our number 1 city. Number 1, Toronto. Toronto's housing market isn't just facing a correction. It's staring down the barrel of a complete systemic collapse that could redefine Canadian real estate for decades. The city represents the epicenter of every dangerous trend we've discussed, magnified by scale and complexity that makes a soft landing virtually impossible. Let's start with the numbers that should terrify everyone. Toronto's condo market, which drove much of the city's recent growth, has already crashed harder than most people realize. Sales are down 64% from 2021 levels, inventory has exploded to 25-year highs, and prices are falling at rates not seen since the 1990s recession. But this is just the beginning. The city faces an unprecedented oversupply crisis as 31,000 condo units are scheduled for completion in 2025 alone, the highest in history. These units were pre-sold to investors during the pandemic frenzy, many of whom used borrowed money and assumed they could flip or rent for easy profits. As these units come online into a saturated market, panic selling could accelerate price declines dramatically. Toronto's employment base, while diverse, is showing serious cracks. The financial sector is implementing major layoffs as banks automate operations and reduce office space. The tech sector has been decimated by funding cuts and hiring freezes. Even healthcare and education, traditionally stable sectors, face budget pressures that could eliminate thousands of positions. But here's what makes Toronto's situation uniquely dangerous. The city's housing market has become completely disconnected from local economic fundamentals. Average home prices that require household incomes over $200,000 in a city where median household income is $84,000. This gap can only be sustained by external demand and easy credit, both of which have disappeared. The federal government's immigration policy changes are reducing the flow of newcomers who historically drove Toronto's rental and ownership demand. International student restrictions are particularly damaging, as these students were a key source of rental income for condo investors. Perhaps most concerning is Toronto's massive debt burden at both individual and municipal levels. Homeowners who stretched to buy during the pandemic face mortgage renewals at much higher rates, forcing many to sell. The city itself faces infrastructure spending pressures that could require property tax increases, adding additional stress to an already strained market. The commercial real estate sector is also collapsing as companies embrace permanent remote work and reduce office space. Downtown vacancy rates are climbing, affecting the condo market as fewer people need to live near offices. This creates a cascading effect through the entire urban economy. So there you have it, the top 10 Ontario cities where housing prices are most vulnerable to crash in 2026. From Sudbury's resource dependency to Toronto's systemic collapse, these markets face fundamental challenges that go far beyond normal cyclical corrections. The combination of oversupply, weakening employment, demographic shifts, and stretched affordability creates perfect storm conditions for significant price declines. What do you think about these predictions? Are you seeing similar warning signs in your local market? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let us know which city surprises you most on this list. If you found this analysis helpful and want to stay ahead of Ontario's changing real estate landscape, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with anyone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into Canada's housing market. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss our latest market insights.